There are people who think in sentences, and there are people who think in systems. Most of us never notice the gap between them until we're standing across a table from someone operating on a level we didn't know existed. They saw the negotiation end 4 moves before it started. They read the room while we were still reading the agenda. They knew what we wanted before we said it out loud. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life inside rooms like that, the courts of Renaissance Florence, where a wrong sentence could end in exile, and a right one could end in power. He didn't write The Prince as a manual for cruelty. He wrote it as a map of cognition, a record of how the sharpest minds, in an age of daggers and diplomacy, actually thought, level by level, while everyone beneath them reacted. Today, we're going to walk through 6 of those levels. Not motivational levels, not a checklist, a hierarchy, because the mind that operates on level 4 sees something the mind on level 1 is structurally incapable of seeing. The same way a chess player rated 2,400 sees a board differently than someone who learned the rules last week. By the end, you'll know exactly which level you're operating on most days. That knowledge alone will be uncomfortable. Stay with it anyway. The first level is the one almost everyone lives on without knowing it: reaction. This is the level of pure stimulus and response. Someone insults you, you snap back. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your body floods with cortisol before your mind even finishes registering what happened. Neuroscience calls this the amygdala hijack, the brain's threat detection system firing faster than the reasoning centers can intervene. A survival mechanism built for predators, now misapplied to slow emails and passive-aggressive text messages. Machiavelli watched princes lose entire territories because they operated permanently at this level. He observed that men are generally quicker to avenge injuries than to reward benefits, meaning the reactive mind is wired asymmetrically, primed for retaliation, blind to strategy. A ruler who governs from insult rather than calculation didn't just make bad decisions. He became predictable, and a predictable mind is a conquered mind before the battle even begins. Because anyone who understands what will make you react now has a lever to pull whenever they need you off balance. This is level 1. Almost everyone starts here. Most people never leave. The second level is where the first real shift happens: observation. This is the level at which a person stops reacting long enough to actually watch what's happening. Not what people say is happening, what's actually occurring in behavior, in patterns, in the small tells that reveal more than any statement ever could. Machiavelli was, above all else, a diplomat before he was a philosopher. He spent years as an envoy, sent to observe foreign courts and report back, not on what rulers claimed, but on what they did. He developed an almost forensic habit of watching actions instead of listening to words, because he understood something that modern psychology would later confirm through decades of research. People are far more honest with their behavior than with their mouths. The mind that reaches level 2 stops asking, "What did they say?" and starts asking, what did they do? And what does that pattern actually predict? This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires suppressing the very reactive instinct we just described, holding judgment in suspension long enough to gather real data before drawing conclusions. Most people skip this step entirely. They form an opinion in the first 4 seconds of an interaction, and then spend the rest of the conversation defending it, filtering out anything that contradicts what they already decided. This is confirmation bias, and it is the single greatest obstacle to reaching level 2, because it makes you feel like you're observing when you're actually just confirming. True observation is uncomfortable because it sometimes tells you things you don't want to know about other people, about yourself. The third level is where most self-help stops, and where the real work actually begins. Self-mastery. Emotional control is not suppression. Carl Jung, writing centuries after Machiavelli, warned explicitly against this confusion. What you suppress does not disappear. It goes underground, into what he called the shadow, and resurfaces later in distorted, uncontrolled ways, usually at the worst possible moment. The person who controls their anger by stuffing it down isn't practicing mastery. They're loading a weapon. Self-mastery is something structurally different. It's the ability to feel the full force of an emotion, the humiliation, the fear, the fury, and still choose your next action from calculation rather than compulsion. It's the gap between stimulus and response that we described in level 1. Except now the gap is being used deliberately as a tool rather than stumbled into by accident. Machiavelli documented this obsessively in his study of rulers. The ones who lasted weren't the ones who felt no fear or anger. They were the ones who could absorb a humiliating defeat, a public insult, an assassination attempt, and respond not from the wound, but from strategy. He wrote admiringly of leaders who could adapt their temperament entirely to circumstance, patient when patience served them, ruthless when ruthlessness served them, because their emotional state never dictated their decisions. Their decisions dictated their emotional state. This is where neuroscience adds something Machiavelli couldn't have measured, but clearly intuited. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, reasoning, and long-term thinking, develops the ability to regulate the amygdala's threat responses, but only with deliberate practice. It's a trainable circuit, not a fixed trait. Every time you pause before reacting, you are, in a very literal neurological sense, strengthening that regulatory pathway. Every time you let the reaction run the show, you're strengthening the opposite one. The person on level 3 isn't calm because they feel less. They're calm because they've built the infrastructure to feel everything and still choose. The fourth level takes observation and self-mastery and combines them into something with real predictive power: pattern recognition. This is the level at which history stops feeling like an endless sequence of surprises and starts feeling like a familiar shape, repeating with different costumes. Machiavelli's method, largely invented by him, was to study Roman history exhaustively, not out of nostalgia, but because he'd noticed something almost nobody else in his era had systematized. Human institutions rise and fall through recurring mechanisms. Conspiracies follow identifiable structures. Power vacuums get filled in predictable ways. Rulers who rely purely on inherited legitimacy rather than earned competence tend to collapse the moment that legitimacy is tested. He wasn't guessing about Renaissance Italy. He was pattern matching it against 500 years of Roman precedent, and the match rate was disturbingly high. Modern cognitive science has since explained why this kind of thinking produces what looks, from the outside, like genius. Research on expert cognition, studies on chess grandmasters going back to Adrien de Groot, found that elite players don't calculate more moves than amateurs. They recognize configurations. A position that looks like chaos to a novice looks like a familiar structure to a master, because the master has stored thousands of prior patterns and can match the current situation against that library almost instantly. This is not raw processing speed. It's compressed experience, organized into retrievable shape. This is why the person on level 4 seems to just know how a situation will unfold. They're not psychic. They've simply seen the pattern before, in a different relationship, a different negotiation, a different office, a different century. If they've studied history the way Machiavelli did, the betrayal that shocks you was, to them, visible 3 steps ahead, because they'd already seen this particular shape of person do this particular shape of thing. Once you start seeing the patterns, a strange thing happens. You stop being surprised by people. Not because you've become cynical, but because you've built a large enough library of human behavior that very little falls outside it anymore. The 5th level is the one Machiavelli is most infamous for, and most misunderstood for: strategic anticipation. This is not merely recognizing patterns after they've started. It's positioning yourself before they do, understanding not just what people have done, but what their incentives will force them to do next, and arranging your own position accordingly. Machiavelli's most quoted, most distorted claim is that it is safer to be feared than loved. If a ruler cannot be both, read in isolation, it sounds like a doctrine of cruelty. Read in context, it's a study in incentive structures. Love, he observed, is a bond maintained by the other person's goodwill. Fragile, revocable, the moment their interest shifts. Fear, properly applied without cruelty, is a bond maintained by consequence, and consequence doesn't waver with someone else's mood. He wasn't recommending cruelty. He was mapping which forms of influence hold up under pressure, and which collapse the moment they're tested. This is strategic anticipation in its purest form. Understanding not what people say motivates them, but what actually does, and building your position around the second thing rather than the first. Robert Greene, writing 5 centuries later, distilled a version of this into a principle worth remembering. The person who reacts is controlled by the person who provoked them. The strategic mind refuses to be that person. This level requires everything beneath it. You cannot anticipate incentives you haven't observed. You cannot position calmly if you're still governed by reaction. You cannot predict a pattern you've never learned to recognize. Strategic anticipation is not a separate skill. It's the compound interest of the first 4 levels, finally paying out. And this is where most people, even talented people, stop. Because the fifth level looks like genius from the outside, and it's tempting to believe you've arrived once you can predict a negotiation or read a room 3 moves ahead. But Machiavelli and Jung, independently, both pointed toward a 6th level. Quieter, less discussed, and in some ways, the hardest of all. Self-confrontation. Here's the trap. The first 5 levels can create if you stop too early. You become extraordinarily skilled at reading other people, anticipating their moves, understanding their incentives, while remaining almost completely blind to your own. This isn't hypothetical. It's the single most common failure mode among people who've developed real strategic sophistication. They can map anyone's psychology except their own. Jung called the unexamined portion of the self the shadow, the impulses, fears, and desires a person refuses to acknowledge because they don't fit the story they've built about who they are. And here's the mechanism that makes this dangerous, even for a mind operating at level 5. Everything you refuse to see in yourself becomes a blind spot that other people, the ones who have also reached level 4 or 5, can locate and exploit. The ambitious person who can't admit their ambition becomes easy to flatter. The person who can't admit their fear of irrelevance becomes easy to threaten with obscurity. Your unexamined shadow is not neutral. It's a lever with your name already carved into it, waiting for someone else's hand. Self-confrontation is the level at which you turn the same forensic, pattern-recognizing, incentive-mapping mind you've built for reading others back onto yourself. What are you actually afraid of? Beneath the version of the fear you're willing to admit to, what do you actually want? Beneath the noble version you'd say out loud at a dinner party, where are you right now, still reacting instead of choosing, still performing a mask instead of operating from clarity? The very thing you'd immediately spot in someone else. This level is the hardest because it offers no audience. Nobody applauds you for confronting your own shadow. There's no negotiation. 1. No room read correctly. No visible proof of the work. It's private, often unpleasant, and never fully finished. Jung considered this a lifelong project, not a task with a completion date. But it's also the level that makes the other 5 stable rather than fragile. A mind that can read every room except its own eventually gets read by someone who's done both. And in every historical account of powerful men and women whose downfall seemed to come from nowhere, if you look closely, it rarely came from nowhere. It came from precisely the blind spot they'd never had the courage to examine, sitting in plain view the entire time to everyone except them. Pattern recognition, where isolated events start, revealing themselves as recurring structures. Strategic anticipation, where you stop responding to the present and start positioning for what incentive makes inevitable. And self-confrontation, the quiet, unglamorous level where the same clarity you've aimed outward finally gets turned inward, closing the one gap that could undo everything built beneath it. Notice that none of these levels require inherited talent. Machiavelli wasn't born into power. He was a mid-level bureaucrat who lost his position, was imprisoned, and wrote his most enduring Insights from the Margins of Political Life, observing power rather than holding it. Jung's entire psychological framework was built from decades of clinical observation, not innate genius. Every level in this hierarchy is a trained capacity, documented across 5 centuries of philosophy and confirmed, level by modern neuroscience and behavioral research. Most people can identify uncomfortably exactly where they stopped climbing. Maybe you've mastered observation, but still get hijacked by your own emotions the moment something personal is at stake. Maybe you can predict everyone else's next move with real precision and have never once turned that same precision on your own unexamined motives. That discomfort is useful. It's more useful than any compliment this video could give you. Machiavelli didn't write to make anyone feel comfortable. He wrote to describe the mechanism exactly as it operates, so that people willing to look honestly could finally see the level they were actually standing on, rather than the level they'd assumed. The 6 levels don't close once you've climbed them. They're not a ladder you finish and then descend from into permanent mastery. Reaction is always available as a default. The amygdala doesn't retire once you've read a book about it. The 6 levels don't close once you've climbed them. They're not a ladder you finish and then descend from into permanent mastery. Reaction is always available as a default. The amygdala doesn't retire once you've read a book about it. Every day presents a fresh choice about which level you'll actually operate from. And the people who seem, from a distance, to possess some rare and permanent genius are usually just the ones who've made that choice correctly, consistently, for years, until it stopped looking like a choice and started looking like a nature. It was never a nature. It was a practice disguised as one. You now know the hierarchy. The only question left is which level you'll choose the next time something happens that makes you want to react first and think later. If this changed how you see your own thinking, subscribe, because this channel exists to keep mapping the machinery beneath the minds. History remembers as brilliant, one uncomfortable level at a time.